close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw unclench. And just settle in. Because tonight, we're going somewhere very far away and very close to home at the same time. We're going back roughly 100,000 years, give or take a few tens of thousands, depending on which population of early humans we're talking about, to somewhere on the savanna of eastern or southern Africa, maybe near a river, maybe near a rocky outcrop, and we're going to spend an entire day there. Not a traumatic day. Not a day with a lion attack or a volcanic eruption, though we'll talk about danger a little later, gently, because it was part of life. No, we're going to spend an ordinary day. The kind that happened over and over again, millions of times, for hundreds of thousands of years, and which shaped, more than almost anything else in the human story, who you are right now, lying there, listening to my voice.
Here's the question I want you to sit with as we begin. What did they actually do all day? Not the headline version, not hunted mammoths and painted caves, but the actual texture of an ordinary Tuesday, so to speak, for a person living as a hunter-gatherer, before agriculture, before cities, before clocks, before almost everything you'd recognize as civilization. It turns out the answer is stranger, slower, and in some ways far more restful than most of us imagine. And that's really the heart of tonight's story, because for a very long time, historians and even some anthropologists assumed early human life must have been a desperate, exhausting scramble for survival, dawn to dusk, no rest, no leisure, nothing but hunger and fear. And it took decades of patient fieldwork, mostly in the 20th century, studying the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth to discover that this picture was almost entirely wrong.
And here's where I want to introduce you to an idea that genuinely reshaped how anthropologists think about human evolution, something called the grandmother hypothesis. It was proposed and developed extensively by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, working with colleagues including James O'Connell, based largely on years of fieldwork among the Hadza. Here's the puzzle Hawkes was trying to solve. Human females, unlike almost every other mammal and unlike most primates, live for decades after menopause, after their reproductive years have ended. From a narrow evolutionary standpoint, that's strange. Why would natural selection favor individuals living so long past their own reproductive window? Hawkes's answer, drawn directly from watching Hadza grandmothers in action, was this. Older women, freed from the demands of nursing their own infants, became extraordinarily effective foragers, spending long hours digging those deep, hard-to-extract tubers that younger mothers juggling a baby simply couldn't manage as efficiently. And critically, they used that surplus food not to feed themselves alone, but to provision their grandchildren, allowing their own daughters to have children again sooner, to wean earlier, to have shorter intervals between births, because there was a grandmother in the background, quietly, patiently, digging up calories and handing them down the family line. In this view, the elderly woman crouched by the fire in the evening, teaching a child how to peel a tuber or crack open a nut, wasn't a marginal figure in the camp. She was, in a very real sense, an engine of human reproductive success, one of the reasons our species could afford such a long, slow, expensive childhood in the first place.
Can you imagine what it must have felt like to be that grandmother? Watching your daughter's children grow up strong, partly because of your own steady, patient labor, day after day, for years? There's something very moving about that, I think. The idea that some of the deepest structures of human family life, structures we still feel today whenever a grandparent steps in to help, might trace back across an almost unthinkable span of time. Now let's turn to the men's side of camp for a while, and to hunting, because hunting occupies an outsized place in our cultural imagination of the past, and it's worth understanding both why that's true and where it needs correcting. Persistence hunting is one of the most extraordinary and, until relatively recently, underappreciated human adaptations. Humans are, in the broad landscape of the animal kingdom, mediocre sprinters. Almost any four-legged predator or prey animal can outrun us over a short distance without even trying hard. But over long distances, in the heat of the day, humans have a secret weapon that very few other large mammals possess: an extraordinarily efficient cooling system. We're covered over almost our entire body in sweat glands, millions of them, and we're relatively hairless compared to other mammals, which lets that sweat actually evaporate and cool the skin rather than getting trapped in fur. Combine that with our upright bipedal gait, remarkably efficient for covering long distances at a steady trot, and you get an animal capable of something almost no other large mammal can manage: sustained pursuit through the hottest part of the day, until the prey animal, which has to stop and pant to cool down, which loses precious minutes doing so, eventually overheats and collapses from exhaustion, unable to run another step.
This isn't speculation drawn purely from ancient bones and stone tools, by the way, though the fossil evidence for our long legs, our arched feet, our particular hip and leg biomechanics all point strongly in this direction too. Persistence hunting has been directly observed and documented in modern times, most famously by a researcher named Louis Liebenberg, who spent years among sand trackers in the Kalahari studying and documenting persistence hunts of kudu antelope, sometimes lasting several hours across brutally hot terrain. The hunter jogging steadily, tracking hoofprints in sand and dust with an almost unbelievable level of skill, reading disturbed pebbles, bent grass, the subtle temperature and texture differences of overturned earth, until the animal, faster than the human over any short distance, simply couldn't outlast him over the long one. And here's something worth really pausing on, because it reframes what hunting actually required day to day. It wasn't primarily about explosive violence or brute strength. It was about patience, about reading a landscape the way you or I might read a familiar book, about an intimate, cumulative, lifelong knowledge of animal behavior built up over years and years of careful, quiet observation. Liebenberg has argued, and it's a genuinely striking idea, that tracking itself, this process of looking at fragmentary evidence, a partial footprint, a broken twig, and reasoning backward to construct a coherent story about what happened and where it's heading, might have been one of the earliest forms of systematic, evidence-based reasoning our species ever practiced, a kind of proto-science, played out in sand and dust, long before anyone wrote anything down.
And this matters enormously for understanding the actual texture of daily life. Hunting large game was not a daily, reliable activity, the way digging tubers was. Big game hunts, especially of large mammals, often failed. A hunter might go out for days without a kill. And this unreliability is actually central to understanding one of the loveliest and most socially important features of hunter-gatherer life, something anthropologists have studied extensively across dozens of cultures: meat sharing. When a hunt succeeded, when a large animal was brought down, the meat, in most documented hunter-gatherer societies, was not simply kept by whoever made the kill, it was shared, often according to quite elaborate, culturally specific rules, across the entire camp, sometimes across neighboring camps too. Among the Juansi San, the person whose arrow actually struck the fatal blow wasn't even necessarily the one who got to decide how the meat was distributed. Ownership of the kill was sometimes tied to who owned the arrow itself, and arrows were frequently borrowed, lent, and exchanged, specifically as a way of spreading out the social obligations and benefits of a successful hunt. There's a wonderful, dry sense of humor documented among the Juansi around this custom too. A successful hunter who returned to camp boasting about his kill would often be deliberately, playfully mocked, teased, told his catch was scrawny and worthless, even when it clearly wasn't. This practice, sometimes called insulting the meat, was studied in detail by the anthropologist Richard Lee, and when he asked a Juansi man why they did it, the man's answer has become almost legendary in anthropological circles. He said, roughly, that when a young man kills much meat, he comes to think of himself as a chief or a big man, and the rest of them as his servants or inferiors, and they can't accept that. So they always speak of his meat as worthless, This way, they cool his heart and make him gentle.
Isn't that a wonderful piece of social engineering? An entire cultural mechanism, refined over who knows how many generations, specifically designed to prevent successful individuals from becoming arrogant, from accumulating status and power over others, to keep the whole group fundamentally, deliberately equal. This connects to something the anthropologist Christopher Bohm has written extensively about, a concept he calls reverse dominance hierarchy. In most primate societies, and presumably in the deeper evolutionary past of our own lineage, dominant individuals, physically strong males especially, tend to accumulate power, resources, and mating access at the expense of others. But in many, many documented hunter-gatherer societies, the group as a whole actively, collectively suppresses this tendency through mockery, through gossip, through social exclusion, and in extreme cases through more serious sanctions, precisely to prevent any one individual from dominating the rest. The egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer camps, in this view, wasn't simply an absence of hierarchy, an innocent, uncomplicated equality. It was an actively, continuously maintained equality, defended through constant, ordinary, everyday social pressure. Think about that for a second. The idea that fairness itself might be, at its root, a kind of ongoing collective project, something people had to keep doing together, day after day, rather than a fact that simply existed on its own. All right, let's pause here for a moment, and let's just breathe. There's no need to hold on to all these names and details: Kristen Hawkes, Richard Lee, Christopher Bohm, Louis Liebenberg. If they're slipping away from you now, drifting, blurring together, that's exactly fine. What matters is the shape of the story, not the footnotes. Let the footnotes go. Keep the shape.
So let's continue moving through this ancient, ordinary day, because we've covered the morning and much of the productive part of the afternoon now: foraging, tracking, the slow accumulation of food. Let's talk about what happened in the hottest hours, in the middle of the day, because this too turns out to be a quietly important part of the story. In many hot climates, and remember, this world we're imagining, this African savanna, this Kalahari-like landscape, could reach truly punishing daytime temperatures, activity in the harshest hours of midday sun was, sensibly, minimized. This is a pattern echoed across countless cultures worldwide. In fact, the classic Mediterranean siesta is a much more recent, culturally specific descendant of something far, far older, a basic physiological wisdom about not exerting yourself needlessly during the hottest part of the day. In hunter-gatherer camps, this often meant a period of rest, shade-seeking, quiet talk, tool repair, perhaps some napping, particularly among children and the elderly. There's actually reasonably good evidence, again drawn from studies of contemporary foraging populations, that short daytime naps were relatively common, though interestingly not universal, and not always long, often closer to what we might call a doze than a deep sleep.
And this is a good moment to talk about something else worth pausing on, because I think it quietly changes how we picture this whole scene. And that's the role of children in all of this, and specifically the role of play. An anthropologist named Barry Hewlett, who has spent an enormous portion of his career among the Aka people, foragers in Central Africa, along with his collaborators, has documented in fascinating detail just how much of early human childhood was structured around play, and how much learning happened not through anything resembling formal instruction, but through observation, imitation, and unstructured practice. Aka children, and children in many similar societies, were rarely, if ever, directly taught skills in the way a modern classroom teaches. No sitting in rows, no explicit lessons in tuber digging technique. Instead, they watched, they tagged along. They were given small, scaled-down versions of adult tools, miniature digging sticks, small bows, and they practiced, endlessly, playfully, on their own terms and their own timeline, gradually absorbing skills that would take years to fully master.
This is sometimes called, in the developmental psychology literature, enskillment, the slow, embodied acquisition of competence through immersion and imitation rather than explicit teaching. And it stands in fairly striking contrast to how most of us, lying here tonight, learn things in our own childhoods, sitting at desks, following curricula, being tested. Neither approach is simply better or worse. That's not really the point I want to make. But there is something worth sitting with in the image of a 4-year-old 100,000 years ago, mimicking her mother's tuber digging motion with a stick half her size, not because anyone told her to, not because there was a lesson plan, but simply because that's what play looked like in her world, and because that play was quietly, patiently, building the exact competence she'd need for the rest of her life. And children weren't only learning subsistence skills through this kind of unstructured immersion. They were learning social rules too, the elaborate, unwritten codes of sharing and fairness and mockery as social correction we talked about a moment ago, absorbed the same way, by watching, by participating in smaller versions of adult social life, by getting corrected gently, through teasing rather than harsh punishment in most of these well-studied societies. There's actually quite good cross-cultural evidence that physical punishment of children was relatively rare and mild in many hunter-gatherer societies compared to many later agricultural and industrial societies. Though of course this varied, and I don't want to paint an idealized, uniformly gentle picture that erases real variation across different groups and different historical moments.
Let's keep the day moving, gently, toward late afternoon now, because there's a part of this story about spoken language and about knowledge itself that I think you'll find genuinely fascinating, and it involves that same researcher I mentioned a moment ago in a different context, the anthropologist Polly Wiesner. Wiesner spent decades, starting in the 1970s, working among the Juhonzi San, and in the early 2010s, she published a study that I find quietly extraordinary because it did something almost nobody had done before. It systematically recorded and analyzed the actual content of conversations, comparing what people talked about during the day versus what they talked about at night around the fire after the sun had gone down.
During daylight hours, Wiesner found, conversation tended to be practical, economic, sometimes tense, focused on complaints, criticism, coordinating tasks, negotiating small disputes over resources or behavior, the ordinary friction of shared life. But at night, once the light of the fire replaced the light of the sun, something shifted. The content of conversation changed dramatically. Nighttime talk, Wiesner found, was overwhelmingly devoted to storytelling, and specifically to a particular kind of storytelling. Tales about distant relatives, about ancestors, about the spirit world, about the elaborate extended social networks that stretched far beyond the immediate camp, sometimes hundreds of kilometers across the Kalahari. These stories, Wiesner argued, weren't merely entertainment, though they certainly were entertaining, full of humor, embellishment, dramatic pauses, exactly the kind of storytelling craft you'd recognize instantly if you heard it. They were also doing something deeper, quietly transmitting the emotional and social knowledge required to maintain relationships across a sprawling, dispersed network of kin and trading partners, teaching, through narrative rather than lecture, the values, the cautionary lessons, the shared history that held a far-flung community together.
So let's slow down, because there's no rush here, and let's walk through this together, hour by hour, the way it might have unfolded. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. The story will still be here, waiting, the next time you want to pick it up. I'll be speaking slowly and quietly, and I'll circle back to things more than once, because that's how memory works best right before sleep, in gentle repetitions, rather than sharp new facts. Let's begin. Let's start before the day even starts, in the dark, because that's actually where a lot of the interesting science is. For a long time, there was a popular idea, you may have even heard it yourself, that people before the industrial era slept in two separate chunks, a first sleep
and a second sleep, with an hour or two of quiet wakefulness in between, maybe for prayer or conversation or tending the fire. This idea comes mostly from historical records in early modern Europe, letters and diaries mentioning a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. It's a lovely idea, and it's probably true for some periods of history. But here's where it gets interesting, and here's where our story about early humans actually begins to challenge some assumptions.
And here's the detail I find most beautiful about her research. Firelight itself, Wiesner suggested, may have played a genuinely important role in enabling this shift. During the day, in bright sunlight, human beings can see each other's faces with total clarity, every expression, every flicker of irritation or impatience laid bare, which tends to keep conversation more guarded, more transactional, more oriented toward the practical business of the moment. But in the dim, flickering light of a campfire, faces become softer, harder to read in fine detail, individual features blurring into warm shadow. And Wiesner proposed that this reduced visual scrutiny might actually free people up, psychologically, to relax their guard, to tell stories, to be a little more vulnerable, a little more playful, a little more willing to imagine and embellish and dream out loud together. Isn't that a lovely thought? That the simple, ancient technology of firelight, flickering there in the dark for maybe 1,000,000 years or more of human and pre-human history, might have been quietly shaping the emotional texture of human conversation itself, nudging us every single evening from the sharp-edged practicality of daylight into something softer, warmer, more communal. If you're picturing that fire right now, the flames low and orange, shapes moving gently against the dark, that's exactly the picture I want you to hold on to, because it's remarkably similar to the picture that, in some very real evolutionary sense, generation after generation after generation of your own ancestors held on to too, at the very end of nearly every single day of their lives, for almost the entirety of human history.
Let's talk a little now about tool making, because it fit into this daily rhythm too, often, interestingly, as a kind of quiet, absorbing evening activity, something done by firelight, hands working almost automatically while conversation continued around it, not unlike the way someone today might knit or whittle while chatting with friends. The archaeological record of stone tools stretches back an almost dizzying length of time, more than 3 million years by some recent discoveries, tools found at a site called Lomekwi in Kenya, predating even our own genus, Homo, entirely, made by some earlier hominin ancestor we're still working to fully identify. By the time we reach the world of 100,000 years ago, the world we're spending our evening in tonight, tool-making had become an extraordinarily refined craft, involving what archaeologists call knapping, the careful, controlled striking of one stone against another, or against a softer material like bone or antler, to flake off precise fragments, shaping a raw nodule of flint or obsidian into a knife edge sharper in relative terms than most surgical steel.
This wasn't a skill you could pick up in an afternoon. Modern flint knappers, hobbyists and archaeologists who've spent years relearning these ancient techniques largely from scratch, will tell you it takes months, sometimes years of practice to produce even a competent hand axe, let alone the more refined blade tools our ancestors were making 100,000 years ago. And this brings us back, in a way, to that idea of enskillment we talked about earlier. Children watching, imitating, practicing, gradually over years absorbing a craft that, once mastered, could be performed almost meditatively, hands moving with practiced ease while the mind wandered freely, engaged in conversation, half listening to a story, watching the fire. There's something quietly moving, I think, about imagining an older man or woman sitting at the edge of the firelight, turning a piece of flint over in weathered hands, striking it gently, precisely, again and again, not even fully looking at what they're doing anymore, because the motion has become so deeply, physically familiar, while somewhere nearby a child listens, wide-eyed, to a story about a distant uncle, or a dangerous river crossing, or a trickster figure from the old stories. Multiple kinds of knowledge, practical and social and narrative, all happening simultaneously, layered together in the same warm circle of light.
Now, let's talk gently, honestly, about danger. Because it was part of this world too, and I don't want to give you a falsely sanitized picture. This isn't meant to alarm you. Quite the opposite, actually. I think understanding it properly is oddly reassuring, so stay with me here. The African savanna 100,000 years ago was home to genuinely dangerous predators: lions, leopards, hyenas. And our ancestors were, in the broad scheme of things, not physically formidable animals compared to them. No claws to speak of, no great size, no natural armor. Nighttime in particular, when human night vision is comparatively poor and many of these predators are active hunters, presented real risk. This is very likely one of the deep evolutionary reasons for a pattern anthropologists have observed across many hunter-gatherer societies. Sleeping in groups, often clustered close together, sometimes with a low fire kept burning through the night, specifically because most large predators have an instinctive wariness of open flame, and sometimes with informal rotating watches, particularly in periods or places of heightened risk.
But here's the detail that I think reframes this in an important way. Despite genuine risk, and despite the vulnerability of small, physically unimpressive primates on a landscape shared with serious predators, the actual measured rates of predation on humans in well-studied hunter-gatherer societies turn out to be relatively low. Not zero, certainly not something to romanticize away entirely, but lower than the campfire horror story version of prehistory might suggest. Group living itself was a huge part of the answer. There is genuine, measurable safety in numbers: more eyes watching, more voices ready to shout an alarm, more bodies ready to grab a burning branch and drive off an approaching predator. Fire itself, as we've discussed, was another huge factor, and simple accumulated ecological knowledge, generations deep, about which areas to avoid at which times of day, about the particular behavior patterns of local predator populations, about the warning signs, alarm calls from other animals, telltale tracks, disturbed vegetation, provided an enormous, quiet layer of protection that isn't always obvious from the outside. I want to be honest with you, though, and not pretend this world was without real, sometimes tragic risk. Childhood mortality, in particular, was almost certainly higher, by modern standards, than almost anything we'd find acceptable today. A fact that shaped grief and family structure in ways that are genuinely difficult, and I think appropriately difficult for us to fully imagine from where we're lying right now. This isn't a detail I want to dwell on for long tonight, because tonight isn't the night for heaviness, but I don't want to erase it either, because I think an honest, full picture of the past honors it more than a purely comforting, simplified one would. Let that thought pass through gently, without lingering on it too hard. It's simply part of the whole, true shape of the story. Before we leave this thread of danger and safety behind, let's spend a few more minutes gently on something closely related: the practical matter of keeping the body itself comfortable, protected, and clean. Because it turns out, this ordinary day involved far more careful, considered body care than the popular image of prehistoric life usually allows for. Clothing, in the world of 100,000 years ago, in a warm African climate, was likely minimal for much of the year, though not absent. Archaeologists have found evidence, again indirect but genuinely compelling, in the form of specialized bone tools interpreted as hide-working implements, and in a remarkable piece of genetic detective work involving, of all things, lice. There are two distinct species of human lice: head lice, and body lice, unlike head lice, require clothing to survive. They live in fabric rather than directly on skin. By comparing the genetic divergence between these two louse species, a rough molecular clock, researchers, including Mark Stoneking, have estimated that clothing, in some meaningful, regular form, likely emerged somewhere between roughly 170,000 and 80,000 years ago, a range that places it, delightfully, right around the same broad era we've been imagining tonight. Isn't that a wonderfully strange way to date an invention? Not through a fossil or an artifact,
but through the evolutionary history of a tiny, unwelcome parasite that only exists because humans started wearing clothes.
Even in warmer climates, some form of covering likely served purposes beyond simple warmth: protection from thorns and biting insects during long tracking expeditions, papooses and slings for carrying infants, simple aprons or wraps, often crafted from softened hide, prepared through exactly the kind of patient, repetitive scraping and working we imagined old Nisa doing by the fire, or from woven plant fiber in regions where suitable materials were available. And in colder regions, colder seasons, higher altitudes, clothing became a matter of genuine survival necessity rather than simple comfort, and the archaeological and genetic evidence for more substantial, tailored clothing involving actual sewing with bone needles, some of the oldest examples recovered from sites in Siberia dating back over 40,000 years, becomes correspondingly clearer and more elaborate the further we move into colder, higher latitude environments and later time periods.
And what about cleanliness and the ordinary care of the body more generally? This is an area where our modern assumptions can lead us astray if we're not careful. There's a persistent casual assumption that people before modern plumbing must simply have been dirty, unwashed, indifferent to hygiene. But the ethnographic and archaeological record actually paints a considerably more nuanced picture. Access to regular bathing depended enormously on local water availability, obviously more difficult in arid regions like the Kalahari than in areas with abundant rivers or lakes. But even in water-scarce environments, researchers have documented careful attention to grooming, that mutual hair-picking and skin-checking we mentioned earlier, serving real practical hygienic functions alongside its social bonding role, removing parasites, tending small wounds and skin irritations before they could worsen. Teeth, interestingly, in many well-studied foraging populations prior to the adoption of high-sugar agricultural diets, show remarkably good health in the archaeological and dental record, far less cavity and decay than became common after the shift to starch and sugar-heavy farming diets, a finding that has genuinely surprised researchers studying the transition from foraging to agriculture, since it runs directly counter to the old assumption that farming automatically improved human health and living conditions across the board.
In fact, this is one of the more startling findings in the whole field. Several researchers, including the physiologist and geographer Jared Diamond in some of his earlier academic work, have pointed to skeletal evidence suggesting that the shift to agriculture for many populations actually brought a measurable decline in average health, height, and even lifespan, at least initially, compared to the varied, nutrient-dense diet and comparatively lighter labor patterns many hunter-gatherer populations enjoyed. It's a genuinely humbling piece of evidence, a reminder that the story of human progress isn't always a simple, steady upward line, that the ordinary day we've been walking through together tonight, in some measurable physical ways, may have offered its inhabitants a healthier, more varied, more secure daily existence than many of their agricultural descendants would go on to experience for centuries afterward. Let's return for a few more unhurried minutes to the hunt itself, because I skimmed past a few details earlier that I think are worth slowing down for, worth really sitting with, because they capture something essential about the particular quality of attention this ancient life demanded.
A persistence hunt, as we discussed, could stretch on for hours, and it's worth picturing the actual texture of that experience a little more fully. The hunter, moving at a steady, sustainable jog, not a sprint, following a set of tracks across sun-baked earth, would periodically lose the trail entirely, the animal's hoofprints vanishing across a stretch of rocky ground, or fading into churned earth where a whole herd had passed through earlier. And here, the tracking skill Louis Liebenberg spent years documenting comes fully into its own, not simply following visible prints, but reasoning, almost like solving a puzzle in real time, about where the animal would most likely have gone, given the terrain, the wind direction, the location of shade and water, effectively building a working mental model of another creature's mind and motivations, then testing that model against small, scattered fragments of physical evidence, a bent blade of grass here, a faint indent in dust there, adjusting the model, moving on, adjusting again.
Liebenberg has written about how remarkably similar this process is, structurally, to formal scientific reasoning, forming a hypothesis, testing it against evidence, revising it when the evidence doesn't fit. And he suggested, provocatively but thoughtfully, that this deeply practiced everyday cognitive skill, refined across countless generations of hunters, might represent one of the true deep roots of human scientific and analytical thinking generally, long before anything resembling formal science existed. Sit with that for a moment. The idea that the careful, patient reasoning happening in a research laboratory today might share a genuine cognitive lineage with a barefoot hunter 100,000 years ago, crouched over a faint hoofprint in red Kalahari dust, quietly working out where a kudu went.
In 2015, a sleep researcher named Jerome Siegel, working out of UCLA, led a study that did something remarkably simple and remarkably difficult at the same time. He and his colleagues attached small wrist monitors, actigraphy devices, to members of 3 hunter-gatherer and forager-horticulturalist societies that still lived, at least partially, outside industrial rhythms: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, sometimes called the Johonsi, and the Simane of Bolivia. These are not literally identical to humans 100,000 years ago, of course. Nobody is claiming that. And I want to be careful and honest with you about that distinction. But they represent, in a rough and useful way, something closer to the ancestral human sleep environment than you or I experience lying here right now, with electric light a switch away and a mattress underneath us. What Siegel's team found surprised a lot of people. These populations, it turned out, mostly slept in a single block, not 2. They didn't sleep more than industrialized populations. In fact, if anything, they slept slightly less on average, somewhere around 6 to 7 hours a night. And here's the detail I really want you to sit with for a second, because it's a strange and beautiful one. Their sleep onset wasn't tied to darkness falling. It was tied to temperature. They tended to fall asleep a couple of hours after sunset, once the ambient temperature had dropped from its daily peak, and they tended to wake up a little before sunrise, as temperatures approached their lowest point of the whole daily cycle. Their bodies, in other words, were reading the thermostat of the world around them, not a clock, not a light switch, but the actual physical coolness of the night air. Think about that for a second. Somewhere inside all of us, underneath the alarm clocks and the blackout curtains, there might still be some faint echo of that old thermal alarm clock, that instinct that says, sleep isn't about the darkness exactly, it's about the cool.
And the physical toll of these hunts was real, and worth acknowledging honestly. Hours of jogging under direct equatorial sun, often without much water carried along, since carrying heavy loads would slow the pursuit, required a particular kind of trained physical endurance and a particular kind of psychological patience, a willingness to keep going long after the prey animal was out of sight, trusting the tracks, trusting the accumulated knowledge, trusting that the animal, however far ahead it currently was, would eventually, inevitably, in that brutal heat, be forced to stop. Successful hunters, in the societies where this practice has been directly studied, were often held in real genuine esteem, not for aggression or dominance. Remember the meat-sharing customs specifically designed to check exactly that kind of status seeking, but for something closer to wisdom, patience, and skill, qualities that, tellingly, tend to accumulate with age and experience rather than raw physical strength alone, which is part of why older hunters, well past their physical prime by any narrow athletic measure, often remained among the most successful and respected trackers in these communities, their advantage lying not in speed, but in the sheer depth of accumulated careful attention paid to the landscape across an entire lifetime.
Let's slow all the way down now, and let's talk for just a few final minutes before we properly wind down about something that gently threads together almost everything we've discussed tonight. And that's the sheer, quiet skillfulness embedded in absolutely everything this ordinary day involved. Nothing about it, when you look closely, was crude or simple or primitive in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries in casual conversation. Reading a landscape for water, reasoning backward from a faint track to an animal's likely path,
knowing which of hundreds of plants would heal a wound and which would do harm, crafting a stone blade sharp enough to split hide with a single controlled stroke, timing a story's rhythm and pause for maximum effect around a fire, managing the complex, delicate diplomacy of shared resources across an egalitarian camp, generation after generation, without ever writing a single rule down. This was, in every meaningful sense, a life of expertise, deep, hard-won, patiently transmitted expertise, held not in books or institutions, but in bodies, in memory, in relationships, in story. And spend some time on a part of this ordinary day we haven't touched yet at all, which is the experience of the very youngest members of camp, the infants, because their day looked quite different from everyone else's, and it turns out to matter enormously for understanding human beings as a whole, including, in a strange roundabout way, why you're able to lie there right now and drift off to the sound of a voice.
Anthropologists who study infant care across hunter-gatherer societies, including detailed work among groups like the Aka and the Efe of Central Africa by researchers such as Barry Hewlett and Melvin Connor, have documented something that stands in fairly sharp contrast to typical infant care patterns in industrialized societies. Infants in these communities were almost constantly held, not occasionally held, not held for feeding and then set down in a crib for the rest of the day, but carried, skin to skin or close to it, for the overwhelming majority of daylight hours, often in a soft sling or wrap resting against the mother's hip or back, sometimes passed for shorter stretches to other caregivers, older siblings, grandmothers, occasionally even fathers or unrelated adults in the camp, a pattern researchers call alloparenting, meaning care provided by individuals other than the biological parents. Melvin Connor, who conducted some of the earliest detailed studies of this kind among the Juhwansi San starting in the 1970s, found that Juhwansi infants were in physical contact with a caregiver for something like 90% of daylight hours in their first year of life, an extraordinary figure by almost any modern industrialized standard. And breastfeeding, correspondingly, wasn't scheduled, the way it often is today, into set intervals of 3 or 4 hours. It was almost constant, brief, frequent nursing sessions, sometimes many times an hour, triggered by the infant's own small cues of fussiness or interest, rather than by any clock. This pattern, researchers believe, likely shaped the composition of human breast milk itself over evolutionary time, relatively low in fat compared to some other mammals, suited to frequent small feedings, rather than the occasional large ones typical of, say, a rabbit or a deer, whose mothers leave them alone in a den for long stretches, and need to deliver a much richer, more concentrated meal in each visit. Think about what that means for a moment. This idea that an infant's entire sensory world, for the first year or more of life, 100,000 years ago, was built around almost continuous physical closeness, warmth, motion, the sound of a heartbeat, the rhythm of walking, rather than the comparatively still, solitary hours many infants spend today in cribs and car seats and bouncers. It's not a judgment on modern parenting, which operates under entirely different practical constraints, but it is, I think, a genuinely useful piece of context, a reminder that so much of what we now consider self-soothing, an infant's ability to calm down alone, in the dark, without contact, is a relatively recent expectation in the sweep of human history, not necessarily the ancestral default.
And there's a detail here I find particularly touching, which is what happened to infants and small children during the night specifically, because it connects directly back to our conversation about sleep. In the overwhelming majority of documented hunter-gatherer societies, co-sleeping, infants and young children sleeping in close physical contact with a parent or caregiver, was close to universal. Solitary infant sleep, a baby alone in its own separate space, was exceedingly rare, and in most of these cultural contexts would likely have seemed, if anyone had even proposed it, faintly alarming, even a little cruel, rather than the neutral default it's often treated as today. James McKenna, a biological anthropologist who has spent much of his career studying the evolutionary basis of co-sleeping,
has argued that this constant nighttime physical closeness likely played a real, measurable role in regulating an infant's breathing, temperature, and arousal patterns. Essentially, the parent's body acting as a kind of external biological pacemaker for the infant's still developing nervous system. So even the youngest, smallest members of that ancient camp, drifting off in the dark, weren't drifting off alone. They were held, breathing in time with someone bigger and steadier beside them, all night, every night, for years.
Let's shift now, gently, to another thread of this daily life that I think you'll find quietly fascinating. And that's the accumulated botanical and medicinal knowledge these communities carried, because it reframes something important about what knowledge even meant in this world, long before anything was written down. Contemporary hunter-gatherer and forager-horticulturalist societies studied by ethnobotanists consistently display an almost staggering depth of plant knowledge. Hundreds, sometimes many hundreds, of distinct plant species identified, named, and understood in fine-grained detail. Which ones are edible raw, which require processing to remove toxins, which serve as effective treatments for wounds, fevers, digestive troubles, snakebite, childbirth complications, and so on. This knowledge wasn't stored in any single person's head in its entirety, though certain individuals, often older women, frequently held disproportionate expertise, functioning as something like the camp's pharmacist and physician combined. Instead, it was distributed, redundant, and cross-checked across the whole group, passed down the same way so much else was passed down, through demonstration, through supervised practice, through the kind of unhurried firelight conversation Polly Wiesner documented, an aunt mentioning, almost in passing, which leaves to avoid after a rain, which bark to chew for a toothache, which root, boiled a certain way, eased the pain of a difficult birth.
Some of this ancient plant knowledge, remarkably, has been validated by modern pharmacology in ways that still surprise researchers. Willow bark, chewed or brewed by numerous traditional societies across multiple continents for pain relief, contains salicin, a direct chemical relative of the active ingredient in aspirin. Certain plants used traditionally as antimalarials or antiparasitics have, upon later chemical analysis, turned out to contain genuinely potent compounds against exactly those conditions. This doesn't mean every traditional remedy was effective, of course. Some surely weren't, and distinguishing effective treatments from purely ritual or placebo ones would have been, and still is, genuinely difficult without controlled trials. But the sheer accumulated volume of accurate botanical and pharmacological knowledge held by these societies, built up not through laboratory experimentation, but through countless generations of careful, patient, trial and error observation, passed carefully from elder to child, represents one of humanity's oldest and least celebrated scientific traditions, a vast, distributed, oral encyclopedia of the living world, carried entirely in memory and practice, refined slowly, endlessly, one generation at a time. Now let's talk softly about something else that filled these evenings, something beyond words entirely, and that's music and movement, because sound and rhythm were woven into daily and nightly life in ways that go back extraordinarily far.
The archaeological record for music is more fragmentary than the record for stone tools or fire, simply because instruments made of wood, sinew, or reed rarely survive tens of thousands of years the way stone does. But we do have remarkable direct evidence even so. Bone flutes, carved with real precision from the wing bones of birds, and in some cases mammoth ivory, have been recovered from sites in what is now Germany, at caves including Hohlefels and Geissenklosterli, dating back some 40,000 years, crafted by early modern humans in Ice Age Europe, with finger holes carefully placed to produce a genuine, playable musical scale. 40,000 years. Long before agriculture, long before writing, long before almost anything we'd call civilization, someone sat down, likely by firelight,
and carved a functioning wind instrument out of a bird's wing bone, with enough care and enough understanding of acoustics to make it musically useful. And beyond instruments, there's the human voice and body itself, humming, singing, clapping, stamping, all of which leave no fossil trace at all, but which anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies find to be an absolutely central, near-nightly feature of communal life. Among groups like the Hadza and various San communities, healing dances, extended communal events involving rhythmic clapping, singing, and dancing, sometimes continuing for hours deep into the night around a central fire, are among the most important social and spiritual practices these communities engage in. During these dances, certain individuals, often people recognized within the community as having particular skill or spiritual sensitivity, are described as entering trance states, sometimes associated with healing practices directed at sick or troubled members of the group. Anthropologists, including Richard Katz, who spent extensive time documenting Juhuanzi healing dances, have described these events as extraordinarily powerful communal experiences, weaving together music, physical exertion, spiritual belief, and collective care for the sick or suffering, all in a single, sustained, night-long ritual.
And here's another detail from that same research that I find quietly comforting. These populations reported very little insomnia. Words for the condition barely existed in some of these languages in the way we mean it, as a chronic complaint. That doesn't mean their sleep was perfect, of course. There were disruptions, cold nights, the cries of infants, the distant calls of predators. But the deep, anxious, ruminating insomnia so common in industrialized life, tied to worry about tomorrow's meeting or an unanswered message, that particular flavor of sleeplessness seems to be, if not entirely a modern invention, at least a modern amplification. So if you're lying there tonight, a little frustrated that sleep doesn't come easily, I want you to hold on to that thought gently, not as a judgment on yourself, but almost as a permission slip, an old reminder that your body still fundamentally knows how to do this, that it's been doing this, one way or another, for hundreds of thousands of years, and that the noise around you, the light, the schedule, the racing thoughts, those are the newer, stranger parts of the picture, not the sleep itself. All right, let's move into the morning now, gently, the way the sun itself would move, slowly climbing over that eastern horizon, painting everything first gray, then a deep orange, then finally that flat, bright daylight that says the day has properly begun.
Think about the layered soundscape of that ancient evening for a moment. The low crackle of the fire, the murmur of Weissner's story-laden conversation, and perhaps, on certain nights, rising above all of it, the steady rhythm of clapping hands and stamping feet and rising wordless song carrying out across the dark savanna, audible perhaps to other camps kilometers away, a signal, intentional or not, that here, in this particular circle of light, people were awake, together, alive, caring for one another in the deepest hours of the night. Let's move now to something visual rather than auditory, something that connects to a much deeper and, in some ways, more mysterious question. The question of when exactly and why our ancestors first began to think symbolically, to represent ideas and identities through deliberate marks and ornaments rather than purely functional tools.
At a site called Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologists led by Christopher Henshelwood have recovered pieces of ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide pigment ranging from yellow to deep red, dating back roughly 70 to 100,000 years, engraved with deliberate geometric cross-hatched patterns, clearly intentional,
clearly not accidental scratches, but purposeful, repeated designs. At the very same site, tiny perforated shell beads have been recovered, shells with holes carefully made near one edge, worn smooth in patterns consistent with having been strung and worn against skin or clothing for extended periods. Evidence, many archaeologists believe, of some of the earliest personal ornamentation in the human story. Jewelry, in the most basic and profound sense of the word, roughly 70,000 years old.
Why does this matter for understanding an ordinary day in this ancient world? Because it tells us that somewhere in the routine of daily life, alongside digging tubers and tracking kudu and tending fires, there was also time, attention, and cognitive energy devoted to something with no direct survival function at all, purely symbolic, purely social and expressive, marks and ornaments that communicated something, group identity perhaps, personal significance, aesthetic pleasure, status, affiliation. We can't always be entirely certain which, but the underlying impulse is unmistakably, recognizably human, in a way that reaches straight across that impossible gulf of time and touches something we'd recognize instantly today: the simple, universal human desire to decorate the body, to make a mark that says, in whatever symbolic language a particular culture had developed, "This is who I am. This is where I belong."
Ochre itself, interestingly, appears to have had uses well beyond pure decoration, too. Some researchers believe it may have served practical functions as well, as an insect repellent, as a component in early adhesives used for hafting stone tools onto wooden handles, even possibly offering some limited protection against ultraviolet sun exposure when applied to skin. But its clearly deliberate, patterned use at sites like Blombos, alongside those carefully strung shell beads, points strongly towards something beyond pure utility, toward a mind capable of abstraction, of using a physical object to stand for an idea, a very early flowering of exactly the same symbolic capacity that tens of thousands of years later would let a listener like you tonight sit with words spoken by a voice you can't see and construct entirely inside your own mind a vivid, detailed picture of a fire, a savanna, a night sky, a world that existed 100,000 years before you were born. Let's talk now about movement across the landscape itself, because this ancient day we've been imagining wasn't lived in one single static place, and understanding the rhythm of seasonal movement adds an important layer to the whole picture.
Most well-documented hunter-gatherer societies were not endlessly, randomly wandering, as an older, less accurate stereotype sometimes suggested, but were what anthropologists call seasonally mobile, moving between a set of known, familiar locations, following the availability of water, of ripening fruit, of migrating game, often returning to the very same favorite campsites, sometimes marked by particular baobab trees, or rock shelters, or river bends, year after year, generation after generation, an intimate, deeply memorized geography passed down through direct experience and through story, the kind of story shared exactly in that soft, expansive nighttime register Wiesner documented.
And this mobility served another crucial function too, maintaining wide, overlapping social and trade networks that stretched across enormous distances, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, connecting camps that might see each other only occasionally at particular seasonal gathering points, but who remained bound together through kinship, through reciprocal gift exchange, and, in the case of the Johansi San, through an elaborate and genuinely fascinating institution called Jaro, extensively documented by the anthropologist Polly Wiesner in earlier research than her firelight studies, a system of delayed, non-equivalent gift exchange between distant partners, arrows, beads, ostrich eggshell jewelry, clothing, passed back and forth over months or years, not for immediate material benefit, since the gifts weren't necessarily of equal value,
and the exchange wasn't instantaneous the way a simple trade would be, but specifically to maintain and strengthen long-distance social bonds, creating a kind of insurance network so that if drought or misfortune struck one area, the people living there had somewhere distant but genuinely, warmly obligated to go.
Isn't that a remarkable piece of social technology? This idea of deliberately, patiently investing in relationships across huge distances, not for any immediate transactional gain, but as a kind of long-term, deeply held insurance policy against the unpredictability of an uncertain world. In a very real sense, these were some of humanity's earliest formal social safety nets, built not out of laws or institutions or paperwork, but out of ostrich eggshell beads and careful memory and the simple, patient act of maintaining a friendship across a very long distance for a very long time. There's one more thread I want to gently pull on before we come back to the fire and begin winding this evening down, and it's a heavier one, so I'll move through it slowly and carefully, the way you'd want someone to move through a heavy topic late at night, and that's the question of death and how these ancient communities met it.
The archaeological record does preserve, at various sites and various time periods, evidence of deliberate burial, bodies placed carefully in the earth, sometimes accompanied by ochre, by shell ornaments, by tools, objects that appear to have been deliberately included, mattered, and required a response beyond mere practical disposal. The exact meaning behind these burial practices, whether they reflect specific beliefs about an afterlife, or simply a powerful emotional need to mark loss, to create a physical place of memory, is something we can only partially reconstruct, and honestly, probably always will only partially reconstruct, since belief itself, unlike a stone tool, doesn't fossilize.
But ethnographic studies of contemporary and recent hunter-gatherer societies offer at least some window into how grief and loss were, and in some communities still are, held communally rather than privately. Mourning in many of these cultures was and is an intensely public, shared, ritualized process involving the whole camp, extended wailing, specific mourning songs, periods of altered behavior and dress, practical support, food, companionship, physical presence, extended to those most directly grieving for extended periods afterward, sometimes weeks or months. There's a thread here that connects gently back to everything else we've talked about tonight: the constant physical closeness of infant care, the communal healing dances, the meat-sharing customs designed to bind the group together, the Exaro gift networks stretching across huge distances. Grief in this world, like almost everything else, was rarely, if ever, carried entirely alone. I don't want to dwell in this heavier space for too long tonight, because that's not where I want to leave you as you drift toward sleep. But I think it belongs in the picture, honestly and gently included, because a full, true understanding of that ancient, ordinary day has to include its full emotional range, its joy and its patience and its loss all together, the way any real, lived human life always does, then and now.
Let's come back now, softly, to something warmer, because as the light fades in our imagined day, as the sky over that ancient savanna shifts from orange to deep blue to that first scattering of stars, I want to talk about one more thing, something that I think, in a way, brings this whole story full circle, back to you, lying there right now, listening. We've talked about fire, about storytelling, about the shift Wiesner documented between the sharp practicality of daytime talk and the soft, expansive, narrative quality of nighttime talk. I want to add one more layer to that picture now, something that connects directly back to where we started tonight, with sleep itself.
The first thing to understand about waking up in a hunter-gatherer camp,
And here I'm drawing heavily on decades of ethnographic work among groups like the Hadza, studied extensively by anthropologists including Frank Marlowe, who spent years living among them starting in the mid-1990s, is that there was no single moment where the day started. There was no bell, no whistle, no shared institutional clock. People simply woke as their bodies woke, often at slightly different times within the same family group, and the camp gradually, almost lazily, came alive. Someone might already be crouched by the coals of last night's fire, coaxing a small flame back into being, breathing gently onto the embers, the way you might blow across the surface of tea that's too hot. This detail matters more than it seems. Fire in this world was not disposable in the way it is for us, something you summon instantly with the flick of a lighter. Fire was something you kept alive, almost the way you'd keep a living thing alive, tended, fed, protected from wind and rain. Because starting a new one from scratch, using a fire drill or a bow drill or a piece of flint struck against pyrite, took real time and real effort, and didn't always succeed on the first try. And this brings us, gently, to something genuinely remarkable, something worth pausing on, because it goes back much, much further than the 100,000-year mark we started with tonight. There's a cave in South Africa called Wonderwork Cave, a name that charmingly means miracle in Afrikaans, and inside it, archaeologists led by researchers including Francesco Berna have found evidence: ash, charred plant remains, and burned bone fragments dating back roughly 1 million years. 1 million years. That's not modern humans yet. That's a much older ancestor, likely Homo erectus, already in some controlled and repeated way using fire deep inside that cave. Now, the exact nature of that control, whether they were making fire from scratch at that point or simply capturing and nurturing wildfires that swept across the landscape, is still debated among archaeologists, and I want to be honest with you that it's debated rather than pretend the science is more settled than it is. But either way, the relationship between our ancestors and fire is almost unimaginably old, far older than agriculture, far older than language as we understand it today, possibly far older than our own species.
There's a fascinating and still actively debated hypothesis in evolutionary anthropology, sometimes associated with researchers looking at the deep history of human sleep architecture, suggesting that the specific structure of human sleep, our particular balance of deep, slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, our tendency, unlike many other primates, to consolidate sleep into a single nighttime block on the ground rather than scattered arboreal naps, may itself be an adaptation shaped partly by exactly this kind of social, firelit, communal sleeping environment. The idea, still being explored and refined, is that sleeping in a protected group around a fire, with informal social vigilance distributed across multiple wakeful or lightly sleeping individuals, may have allowed our ancestors to sleep more deeply, more efficiently, in shorter total windows than a solitary or arboreal sleeping ancestor could safely manage. In other words, the very fact that you can drop into deep, restorative sleep relatively quickly, the way you're hopefully starting to feel right now, may be a gift in some very indirect, very deep evolutionary sense from all those nights spent sleeping close together, fire crackling low, someone's breathing steady beside you, generation after generation after generation, going back further than we can really fully comprehend.
There's one more piece of this ancient day I want to walk through with you before we let the fire burn down completely, and it's about water. Because for all the attention hunting and gathering usually get in these kinds of stories, almost nothing mattered more, day to day, than knowing exactly where water was and exactly how to find it when the obvious sources had dried up. In arid and semi-arid environments like the Kalahari, the difference between a thriving camp and a desperate one often came down to an intimate, deeply memorized knowledge of the landscape's hidden water. Johansi sand trackers and elders, studied extensively by researchers including Richard Lee, were documented locating water in ways that seem almost magical until you understand the sheer accumulated observational skill behind them, reading the behavior of certain birds that never stray far from water sources, recognizing particular plants whose roots store surprisingly large reserves of moisture, capable of being dug up, crushed, and squeezed to yield drinkable liquid even in the driest months, and knowing the precise, hidden locations of subterranean water pockets, sip wells, sometimes marked by nothing more than a particular quality of soil or a specific configuration of vegetation that would mean absolutely nothing to an untrained eye, but which, to someone who had walked that same stretch of land 1,000 times since childhood, practically shouted its message.
There's a particular technique documented among sand communities worth pausing on because it's such a wonderfully clever piece of applied engineering, using a hollow reed as a straw, inserted carefully into damp sand to suck water up from just below the surface, sometimes filling an ostrich eggshell canteen this way, drop by careful drop, over the course of an hour or more. A canteen that could then be sealed with a plug of grass and buried, cached, at a known location along a regular travel route for use on a future journey. Ostrich eggshells, in fact, served as one of the most important storage technologies in this world, remarkably durable, naturally sealed, capable of holding roughly a liter of water each, and archaeologists have found caches of engraved ostrich eggshell fragments, marked with individual, identifying patterns, not unlike a signature, at sites tens of thousands of years old, suggesting that these buried water reserves were personally owned, marked, and respected as such by everyone who might come across them in the vast shared landscape.
Think about the sheer, quiet intelligence embedded in that system for a moment. Water located through generations of accumulated ecological knowledge, extracted through a clever bit of straw and sand engineering, stored in a naturally engineered eggshell container, marked with a personal signature, and cached at a specific point along a known travel route, ready and waiting for a future thirsty traveler, possibly weeks or months later. None of this required writing. None of it required formal institutions or maps on paper. It required only memory, patience, and the kind of deep working familiarity with a landscape that comes from actually living inside it, generation after generation, rather than simply passing through. Let's talk for a little while now about language itself, gently, because we've been talking all evening about conversation and storytelling without really pausing on the extraordinary tool that made all of it possible in the first place.
The precise origins of human language remain one of the most genuinely contested questions in the whole of human evolutionary science, and I want to be honest with you that there's no single settled answer here, only a range of thoughtful, competing hypotheses. Some researchers point to anatomical evidence, changes in the shape of the hyoid bone, a small, delicate bone in the throat involved in speech production, found in a form similar to modern humans in Neanderthal remains as well, suggesting the physical capacity for complex speech may reach back several 100,000 years, possibly predating the split between our own lineage and the Neanderthal one. Others point to genetic evidence, particularly a gene called FOXP2, involved in fine motor control of the mouth and face and strongly linked to language ability in modern humans, which appears in a functionally similar form in Neanderthal DNA recovered from ancient remains, again suggesting deep roots. Still others argue that full, syntactically complex language as we'd recognize it may have emerged more recently, alongside the broader flowering of symbolic behavior we see at sites like Blombos Cave.
What we can say with more confidence is this. By the time we reach the world of our ordinary day tonight, 100,000 years ago or so, there was almost certainly some form of rich, expressive spoken communication happening around that fire, complex enough to carry the kind of layered, emotionally textured storytelling Polly Wiesner documented among contemporary sand communities, complex enough to transmit detailed botanical and medicinal knowledge accurately across generations, complex enough to coordinate a hunt, negotiate a dispute, tease a boastful young hunter back into appropriate humility, comfort a grieving parent, and lull a restless child toward sleep with a familiar, well-worn story. Language, whenever exactly it crystallized into something like its modern form, is arguably the single technology that made every other thread of this evening's story possible. The actual medium through which fire-tending technique and tracking wisdom and plant knowledge and social custom were held together, generation after generation, in a continuous, living, spoken chain, stretching from someone standing at a graveside 70,000 years ago at Blombos, all the way to this very sentence, reaching you now.
And since we're talking about language and about sleep together, I want to spend a few minutes on one more thing, something a little more mysterious and speculative than the rest of tonight's journey, and that's the question of dreams, and what they might have meant to the people whose ordinary day we've been imagining. We can't, of course, directly access the dream life of someone who lived 100,000 years ago. Dreams leave no fossils, no ash, no engraved ochre. But we do have, again, the patient, careful record of ethnographic fieldwork among contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, and it consistently shows dreams treated not as meaningless neural noise, the way a strictly clinical modern framing sometimes reduces them, but as genuinely significant events, worthy of careful telling and interpretation the next morning, sometimes carrying real social or spiritual weight. Among various San communities, and in many other hunter-gatherer and small-scale societies studied around the world, dreams have often been understood as a kind of travel, the dreaming self journeying beyond the ordinary boundaries of the body, sometimes visiting distant relatives, sometimes receiving messages or warnings from ancestors, sometimes offering guidance relevant to a coming hunt or a brewing social conflict.
There's a lovely, gentle logic to this if you sit with it for a moment. In a world without written records, without photographs, without any external technology of memory beyond the human mind itself, the vivid, often strange, often emotionally charged experience of dreaming would understandably have carried enormous weight, an internal cinema playing every single night, populated by faces of the dead, by half-remembered places, by fears and hopes given strange and sometimes beautiful shape. It's not hard to imagine why so many cultures independently arrived at the idea that dreams meant something, that they deserved to be told aloud the next morning, turned over, discussed, woven into the ongoing shared narrative of the group, one more thread in that same great, patient tapestry of storytelling that filled the evenings around the fire. So if tonight your own mind starts to drift into something dreamlike, strange images rising up unbidden, half-formed scenes, faces you half recognize, I want you to hold on to just a little of that old framing if it helps. Not something to analyze or worry over, just company. Just the oldest form of storytelling there is, the mind telling itself a story, in private, in the dark, the way it's been doing, one way or another, for as long as there have been minds capable of imagining anything at all.
Let me bring all of this together now for just a few more minutes with a single, more personal, more imagined thread, because I think it might help everything we've talked about tonight settle a little more gently into place. Picture, if you can, one particular ordinary evening in one particular small camp, and one particular older woman there, someone we might imagine calling, just for tonight's telling, something like Old Nisa, a name borrowed loosely from the real oral histories some anthropologists, including Marjorie Shostak in her remarkable book built from decades of recorded conversation with a Juhuanzi woman of that very name, managed to preserve in such vivid human detail. Old Nisa, in our imagined version of her, has spent the morning, as she spent countless mornings before it, out with two of her granddaughters, showing them, without any formal lesson, simply by doing it herself while they watched and occasionally tried their own small hands at it, exactly where to find the particular reddish soil that marks the presence of a deeply buried tuber, exactly how much force to use with the digging stick so it doesn't snap against the hard, sun-baked ground, exactly how to twist and pry rather than simply pull,
so the whole route comes free instead of breaking off underground and wasting the effort. By midday, the heat has driven them back toward the shade of camp, and Nisa rests, chatting quietly with two other women, picking gently through a granddaughter's hair while the child half dozes against her knee.
In the afternoon, she works a piece of hide with her hands, softening it, an old, repetitive, almost meditative motion, while nearby, a young man carefully naps a fresh edge onto a stone blade, the two of them talking, easily, about nothing in particular, about a cousin's upcoming visit, about a strange cloud formation on the horizon that might or might not mean rain in the coming days. As the sun drops and the heat finally, mercifully breaks, the whole small camp gradually gathers, drawn together by nothing more than the simple, ancient gravity of a fire being built up for the evening. Someone begins telling, for perhaps the dozenth time in Nisa's own long life, a familiar story about a distant relative and a dangerous river crossing, and a moment of surprising luck, embellished a little more with each new telling. And everyone listens anyway, laughs in all the familiar places, because the pleasure was never really about surprise. It was about the warm, warm comfort of hearing something well-loved told again, together, in the dark.
And there's a scientist, Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard, who has spent much of his career arguing for something he calls the cooking hypothesis, the idea that the control of fire, and specifically the invention of cooking, was not a minor convenience in human evolution, but one of the central engines of it. His argument, and it's a genuinely elegant one, even if not every detail is universally accepted, goes roughly like this. Cooked food is dramatically easier to digest than raw food. It takes less energy to break down, and it releases more calories per bite. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, spend hours upon hours each day just chewing raw food, sometimes 5 or 6 hours a day of pure mastication. Once our ancestors started cooking, Wrangham argues, that digestive burden dropped enormously, freeing up energy, actual metabolic energy, that could be redirected elsewhere. And where might it have gone? Increasingly, many researchers believe, into the brain, an organ that pound for pound consumes an extraordinary amount of our daily energy budget, something like 20% of it in modern humans, despite being only about 2% of our body weight. Sit with that for a moment. The simple, humble act of holding a flame steady, of feeding it twigs through the night, might be tangled up, in some deep evolutionary sense, with the very existence of the mind that's imagining this scene right now. So, in the morning, someone tends the fire, and around that fire, slowly, the rest of the camp stirs.
Later, much later, when the fire has burned down to a low, steady bed of coals, Nisa lies down close beside her daughter and one of the grandchildren, the night air finally cooling toward that particular temperature Jerome Siegel's research would, tens of thousands of years later, identify as the real physiological trigger for sleep, more reliable in the end than the simple falling of darkness itself. She doesn't think about any of the science we've discussed tonight, of course. She doesn't need to. Her body simply knows, the way it's known every single night of her long life, the way the bodies of her mother and her mother's mother knew before her, stretching back through an unbroken, living chain that this particular telling of ours can only gesture toward, never fully capture. And she sleeps. Let's spend a few final, unhurried minutes on one more practical thread before we let the evening close, and that's shelter. Because where and how these ordinary days were physically housed matters too, and it's a gentler note to end our factual journey on before we drift into the wind-down proper.
Contrary to the sturdy, four-walled image the word shelter might conjure for you tonight, hunter-gatherer dwellings across most of human history were often remarkably light, simple, and quick to build. And this wasn't a failure of ambition or ability. It was a deliberate, sensible adaptation to a genuinely mobile way of life. Among the Hadza, studied in detail by Frank Marlowe, Temporary shelters, little more than a simple dome of bent branches, sometimes covered with grass or hide, could be, and often were, built by a single woman in under an hour, sturdy enough to provide shade and a windbreak and a bit of privacy, but never intended to last more than a few weeks or months before the camp moved again, following food and water to the next favored familiar site. There's something almost freeing in that image, isn't there? A home built quickly, competently, without excessive investment or worry, used fully and gratefully for its season, and then, without much ceremony or regret, simply left behind when it was time to move on.
Marlowe, who spent years living among and studying the Hadza, has written with real warmth and humor about his own experience adjusting to this rhythm, was abandoned, while the Hadza themselves showed no such attachment at all, already thinking ahead, cheerfully, to the next site, the next stretch of good foraging, the next familiar baobab tree under which they'd have camped many times before across many years. It's a small, human, slightly funny detail, a well-trained anthropologist quietly discovering that his own deep cultural assumptions about home and permanence weren't universal at all, but simply one particular way, among many equally valid ways, of relating to a physical place.
And weather, of course, mattered enormously to the shape of any given day, rain in particular. In many hunter-gatherer societies, the arrival of the rainy season brought real, welcome abundance, fresh growth, ripening fruit, replenished water sources, but also real disruption, rivers swelling, familiar paths becoming difficult or dangerous to cross, insects multiplying, and camps sometimes needing to relocate quickly to higher, drier ground. There's good ethnographic evidence that rain itself, especially a first heavy rain breaking a long dry spell, was often met with real, unrestrained collective joy, singing, dancing, children running out deliberately to be soaked by it, an emotional response that makes complete sense once you understand just how directly, intimately, the whole rhythm of daily life depended on water's availability. No faucet to turn, no reservoir managed invisibly out of sight, just the sky itself, directly, nakedly, determining whether the coming months would be easy or hard.
I want to return for just a moment to Richard Wrangham and his cooking hypothesis, because there's a small humanizing detail about him worth sharing before we finally let the fire burn all the way down tonight. Wrangham has written, in some of his more personal reflections on his own research, about how the idea for the cooking hypothesis first began crystallizing for him not in a laboratory or a library, but while he was doing field work observing wild chimpanzees in Tanzania's Gombe, the very same forests where Jane Goodall had conducted her own pioneering, patient decades of observation. Watching chimpanzees spend such an enormous portion of every single day simply chewing tough, fibrous, raw plant food, Wrangham found himself wondering, almost idly at first, what would happen to a great ape's daily schedule, and its whole life, really, if that chewing burden were simply lifted, if some clever, curious ancestor found a way to make food easier to eat and easier to digest. That small, wandering thought, born from months of patient, quiet animal observation, eventually grew into one of the more influential and debated ideas in the whole field of human evolutionary biology. It's a nice reminder, I think, of how much of the deepest, most far-reaching scientific insight begins not with grand theorizing, but with simple, patient, curious attention paid to something ordinary. The exact same quality of attention, in fact, that a persistence hunter pays to a faint track in the sand, or a grandmother pays to the particular quality of soil that signals a varied tuber below. And there's a similarly human, similarly grounding detail worth sharing about Polly Wiesner, too, since her research on firelight conversation has threaded through so much of tonight's story. Wiesner has written about how her insight into the day versus night division of conversation topics actually grew out of decades of simply sitting, notebook in hand, in Juho Sansi camps, year after year,
across a research relationship that stretched back to her very first fieldwork there in the 1970s, long before she published the specific firelight study we discussed earlier. It wasn't a single flash of insight, but a slow, accumulated pattern, noticed gradually, across countless individual evenings, each one unremarkable on its own, until the larger shape of the pattern finally became undeniable. There's something quietly moving in that, too. The idea that some of our deepest understanding of these ancient rhythms has come not from clever laboratory experiments, but from researchers doing something structurally very similar to what their subjects were doing all along, showing up, patiently, night after night, and simply, attentively listening.
There's another whole dimension of this ancient world I haven't touched on yet, and it's worth spending some time with, because it stretches our picture of that ordinary day well beyond the dry savanna we've mostly been imagining tonight. And that's the world of the coast, because a great many of our ancestors, especially during certain critical periods of human prehistory, lived not inland but along the shore, and the rhythm of their day was shaped by an entirely different and in some ways gentler calendar, the tides. At a site called Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa, not far at all from Blombo's Cave, archaeologists led by Curtis Moran have found extensive evidence of shellfish harvesting dating back well over 100,000 years, layers upon layers of discarded shells, brown mussel and giant periwinkle among them, alongside stone tools finely crafted using a technique called heat treatment, deliberately baking certain types of stone in buried fires to change its internal structure and make it easier to flake into sharper blades. A genuinely sophisticated bit of applied material science, refined long before anyone had a word for chemistry.
Marion has argued, and it's a genuinely compelling piece of the human story, that coastal shellfish gathering may have played a crucial, steadying role during a particularly harsh climatic period in Africa's deep past, a period of extended cooling and drying that would have made inland foraging considerably less reliable. Shellfish, unlike a fleeing antelope, don't run. They cluster predictably along known stretches of rocky shoreline, replenished reliably by the rhythm of the tides, and gathering them required nothing more than the patient, practiced knowledge of exactly when the tide would be low enough and exactly which rocks and pools would be richest. Knowledge, once again, built up and passed down across generations, almost certainly disproportionately by women and children, wading out at low tide with simple digging and prying tools, working the retreating waterline the way inland foragers worked the dry savanna soil for tubers.
Picture, for a moment, how different the sensory texture of that particular version of the ordinary day must have been. The smell of salt rather than dust, the sound of waves rather than wind through dry grass, the rhythm of the tides rather than the rhythm of the midday heat, structuring the whole shape of the morning. And yet, underneath that different sensory surface, so much of the deeper pattern remains recognizably the same. Patient, skilled, reliable food gathering, largely by women, feeding into a shared egalitarian camp, supplemented by the less reliable, higher risk, higher reward pursuit of larger game further inland, largely by men. Everything eventually converging back at a fire in the evening, where the stories, whatever their specific local content, whatever gods or ancestors or distant ocean-crossing cousins they involved, still did the same essential work of binding a scattered, mobile community together across time and distance.
Let's talk gently for a few more minutes about growing up in this world, about the specific passage from childhood into adulthood, because it wasn't simply a gradual, unmarked drift the way it can sometimes feel in modern life, but was, in a great many documented hunter-gatherer societies, marked by real, deliberate ritual, moments the whole community paused to notice and honor. Among many San groups, a young man's first successful large kill was traditionally marked by a specific ceremony, sometimes involving careful, ritualized cuts made on his body, into which fat or other substances associated with strength and skill from the killed animal would be rubbed, a physical, bodily marking of the transition from boy to hunter, from someone who is taught to someone who now, at least in part, provides. Similarly, among many hunter-gatherer societies, a girl's first menstruation was marked by significant ritual attention, sometimes a period of seclusion, often accompanied by specific songs, dances, and teachings from older women, an occasion treated not with the awkward silence or embarrassment it sometimes met with in other cultural contexts, but as a genuinely significant, honored transition worthy of the whole camp's attention and celebration.
Here's something that consistently surprised early researchers who went to live among modern hunter-gatherer groups expecting to document constant, grinding labor. The mornings in many of these societies were unhurried, almost leisurely by our standards. There was talking. There was grooming, in the literal sense, picking through hair, tending small wounds, the kind of physical closeness that in primates generally serves an enormous social bonding function. There was often, especially among children, simply play. And there was food, because unlike the popular image of constant hunger, most well-documented hunter-gatherer societies, when studied carefully, turned out to eat reasonably well, reasonably reliably, for most of the year. This connects to one of the more quietly revolutionary pieces of anthropological research of the 20th century, a paper delivered in 1966 by an anthropologist named Marshall Solins, drawing on data collected by researchers like Richard Lee among the Juhansi San of the Kalahari. Solins gave his paper and later his essay a wonderfully provocative title, The Original Affluent Society. His argument was this: we tend to measure affluence, wealth, by how much we produce and consume. But there's another way to measure it, by how easily and completely your wants are satisfied. And by that second measure, Solins argued, hunter-gatherers weren't poor and desperate at all. Richard Lee's fieldwork among the Juhansi in the 1960s found that adults, on average, spent something like 15 to 20 hours a week on subsistence activities, gathering food, hunting, tool maintenance. 15 to 20 hours a week. Think about your own week for a moment, the hours you spend working, commuting, managing logistics, and compare that to 15 or 20 hours spent actually procuring the food you eat. The rest of the time, according to Lee's observations, was spent resting, socializing, storytelling, and in what he rather charmingly called in his notes, just sitting around.
These rituals mattered, anthropologists studying them have suggested, because they did real psychological and social work, giving young people a clear, community-witnessed marker of their changing status and changing responsibilities, rather than leaving that whole disorienting process to unfold privately, invisibly, without any collective acknowledgement at all. There's something worth sitting with in that, I think. The idea that this ancient world, for all its material simplicity by modern standards, had developed remarkably thoughtful, remarkably deliberate social technologies for handling exactly the kinds of emotionally complicated transitions, growing up, growing old, losing a loved one, that we, in our materially far richer, but sometimes socially thinner modern world, still sometimes struggle to handle with as much collective grace.
And what of old age itself, beyond the specific role of the grandmother we discussed earlier? Contrary to another old, inaccurate stereotype, the image of hunter-gatherer societies callously abandoning their elderly the moment they became a physical burden, the ethnographic record actually shows something quite different in the great majority of documented cases. Sustained, committed care for elderly members of the group, even when those elders could no longer contribute much materially at all. This makes sense once you fully absorb everything we've discussed tonight. elders as the primary keepers and tellers of the very stories that held the whole social fabric of the group together, elders as the deepest, most experienced trackers and healers and ecological experts in the community, elders as living memory in a world with no other way to store information across time. Abandoning that resource would have meant abandoning, quite literally, the accumulated wisdom of the entire group, and the record suggests that these communities understood that, valued it, and organized real practical care around protecting and sustaining it for as long as possible.
And I want the pace to soften even more here, the way the fire itself would be softening at this point in the story. Embers glowing rather than flaming, voices around the circle growing quieter, more spaced out, punctuated by longer and longer silences, until eventually, one by one, people simply stop talking altogether and let the night take over. Let's spend a few more unhurried minutes on one last thread before we let the story settle into its close, because it's a thread that changes the whole picture from a single, small, isolated camp into something much larger, much more social, and I think genuinely delightful to picture. And that's the question of what happened when multiple bands came together.
For most of the year, in most well-documented hunter-gatherer societies, the basic living unit was small, a band of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, small enough to move easily across the landscape, small enough to be sustained reliably by the surrounding foraging territory. But this small band pattern wasn't the whole story. At certain predictable points in the year, tied to the seasonal abundance of a particular resource, a river full of spawning fish, a stretch of forest thick with ripening fruit, a plain crossed by migrating herds, multiple bands would converge, sometimes numbering into the hundreds of individuals all told, for periods of intense, concentrated social activity.
Anthropologists studying these seasonal aggregation sites, including detailed archaeological work on sites believed to represent exactly this kind of periodic large gathering, describe them as genuinely important social engines, occasions for arranging marriages between bands that otherwise rarely crossed paths, for settling disputes that had been simmering unresolved for months, for trading, for elaborate multi-night ceremonies and healing dances involving far more participants and far more collective energy than any single small band could ever generate on its own. And crucially, for exactly the kind of wide-ranging, information-rich conversation that kept a scattered population's collective knowledge current and consistent. Who had died, who had married, where the game had moved, which waterholes had dried up, which had recently filled.
Some archaeologists and anthropologists, including Jean Klotz in his extensive research on the painted caves of Ice Age Europe, have proposed that many of the most spectacular known examples of prehistoric art, the great painted galleries at sites like Lascaux and Chauvet in France, dating back tens of thousands of years, densely layered with images of horses, bison, lions, rhinoceroses, rendered with an artistic sophistication that still genuinely astonishes people who see them today, may have been created and used specifically in the context of these larger, periodic gatherings, communal ritual spaces, visited and added to across many generations, serving as a kind of shared, physical, deeply meaningful gathering point, precisely because they were extraordinary, precisely because a journey to see and add to them required real effort and real intention, making the whole occasion feel appropriately significant.
Picture for a moment the sheer sensory and social intensity of one of these larger gatherings after the quiet, small-scale rhythm of the ordinary daily life we've spent most of tonight exploring together. Dozens of fires instead of one, hundreds of voices instead of a handful, Dances and songs drawing on traditions from multiple bands, all merging together for a few intense, memorable nights. A level of social and sensory stimulation that must have felt almost overwhelming after months of small band quiet, and which likely served, in its own way, exactly the function a modern festival or family reunion serves today: an intense, temporary flooding of connection and stimulation, followed by a welcome, gentle return to the smaller, quieter rhythms of ordinary daily life once the gathering dispersed and each band returned to its own familiar stretch of territory.
And it's worth pausing, gently, on how this entire way of life, so richly, patiently refined across such an enormous span of time, eventually began to change, not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but gradually, unevenly, across many thousands of years and many different regions of the world, as some populations began, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, first in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, and later, independently, in several other regions of the world entirely on their own separate timelines, to deliberately cultivate certain plants, to deliberately manage and eventually domesticate certain animals, setting in motion the long, slow transition toward agriculture, toward settled villages, toward the eventual rise of cities and writing, and everything that followed.
I don't want to spend long on this transition tonight, because tonight's story really belongs to the world before it. But I think it's worth noting, gently, as we start to draw this evening's journey to a close, that this transition, when researchers have been able to study it carefully through skeletal evidence, through comparative studies of surviving foraging and farming populations, does not appear to have been a simple, straightforward upgrade, the neat, tidy story of progress it's sometimes still presented as in shorter, less careful tellings. Early farming populations, in many well-studied cases, show evidence of harder physical labor, poorer average nutrition, especially in populations that came to rely heavily on a small number of staple grain crops rather than the sweeping dietary variety a skilled forager could draw on, and higher susceptibility to infectious disease, a consequence partly of denser, more settled populations living in closer, more permanent proximity to each other and to domesticated animals. Height, measured from skeletal remains across the transition in several well-studied regions, actually appears to have declined, on average, for a considerable period following the shift to agriculture, only slowly recovering in some regions over subsequent centuries.
None of this is meant to suggest agriculture was some kind of terrible mistake, exactly. It eventually enabled almost everything about the world you and I live in now, including, in some very roundabout, complicated way, this very recording, this very voice reaching you tonight through technology unimaginable to anyone in the world we've spent this evening exploring together. But it is worth holding on to, gently, as one more piece of honest context. A reminder that the ordinary day we've spent tonight walking through together, that long, slow, patient, deeply skilled hunter-gatherer rhythm of foraging and tracking and firelight storytelling, wasn't some primitive, deficient stepping stone on the way to something obviously and uniformly better. It was, by many careful, honest measures, a genuinely successful, sustainable, remarkably long-lived way of life, one that worked, one that fed people, protected people, bound people together in deep and lasting relationship, for a span of time hundreds of thousands of years that dwarfs, by an almost unimaginable margin, the roughly 10 or 12,000 years that have passed since agriculture began, and the mere few hundred years since anything resembling our own modern industrial world came into being. Now, I want to be careful here, because this picture has been refined and complicated since the 1960s. Later researchers, including some who work directly with Solons's original data, pointed out that his numbers may have undercounted certain kinds of labor, particularly food processing and childcare, work disproportionately done by women,
which doesn't always get logged the same way hunting trips do. Anthropologists like Kristen Hawkes and others have added enormous nuance to this picture over the following decades. But even with those corrections, even accounting for the labor that got missed in the earliest counts, the broad shape of the finding held up remarkably well across dozens of subsequent studies of different foraging societies around the world, from the Hadza of Tanzania to the Aceh of Paraguay to the Batek of Malaysia. Life was not, in general, a non-stop, desperate scramble. It had real leisure built into it, real slowness, real time simply spent together, doing very little at all. Isn't that a strange thing to hear, lying there tonight, in a world that so often measures a good life by how full the calendar is? There's something almost startling about the idea that for the vast majority of human history, for the hundreds of thousands of years before agriculture locked people into the relentless seasonal demands of planting and harvesting, before industrial clocks demanded punctuality down to the minute, people simply had more unstructured time than most of us do now. Let that settle over you for a moment. There's no need to do anything with that thought. Just let it sit there, quietly, like a stone dropped into still water. Let that thought settle over you for a moment. The sheer scale of it. If you imagine the whole story of anatomically modern humans as a single day, 24 hours, agriculture wouldn't begin until somewhere in the final half hour or so. And everything you'd recognize as modern life, the lights, the schedules, the screens, wouldn't arrive until the very last few seconds before midnight. Almost the entire day in that picture, almost the entire vast, patient sweep of it, belongs to exactly the kind of life we've spent tonight exploring together. Fire, foraging, tracking, story, rest.
Waking not to an alarm, but to a subtle drop in temperature. Tending a fire that connects back, astonishingly, across perhaps 1,000,000 years of continuous human and pre-human relationship with flame. Mornings that were, contrary to old assumptions, often unhurried, social, even leisurely. Women digging deep, reliable tubers supported in later life by that remarkable institution of grandmothering that Kristen Hawkes helped us understand. Men engaged in the patient, skillful, sometimes unsuccessful art of persistence hunting, an entire proto-scientific discipline of tracking built into the sand and dust of the landscape itself. Meat, when it came, shared according to careful, deliberately humbling social customs, designed with real cleverness to keep any one person from rising too far above the rest. A midday lull, a retreat from the harshest heat, small children playing at scaled-down versions of adult tasks, absorbing a lifetime of skill through nothing more than watching and mimicking, and being gently, patiently included. And then, as the light faded, that beautiful shift Polly Wiesner documented, from the sharp, practical talk of daylight into the soft, expansive, story-laden talk of firelight. Hands perhaps still working stone into blades, half-consciously, while ancient tales of distant kin and trickster spirits and cautionary lessons drifted around the circle. Layer upon layer of knowledge, practical and social and mythic, all being passed down at once, the way it had been passed down night after night, for longer than any of us can truly picture.
Let's spend just a few more minutes before that final image settles in fully, looking upward. Because above all of this, above the fire and the murmured conversation and the sleeping children, there was always the sky. And it's worth pausing on what that sky actually meant to the people living beneath it. Without any city lights for hundreds of kilometers in any direction, without any of the atmospheric haze that mutes the night sky in so much of the modern world, The sky above an ancient African camp would have been almost unimaginably rich by the standards of anyone lying here tonight in a world of streetlights and glowing screens. The full sweep of the Milky Way, visible as an actual bright band across the darkness, thousands upon thousands of individual stars visible to the naked eye, far more than the handful most of us can pick out from a typical modern backyard. And this extraordinary visible sky was, unsurprisingly, deeply woven into the knowledge and storytelling of these communities.
Among various sand groups, ethnographers have recorded rich, detailed star lore, constellations linked to specific animals and ancestral figures, particular stars used as practical seasonal markers, signaling, for instance, roughly when certain plants would come into fruit, or when certain migratory patterns of game might be expected to shift. The heliacal rising of certain bright stars, their first reappearance in the eastern sky just before dawn after a period of being hidden below the horizon, served in many traditional societies around the world as remarkably precise, reliable seasonal calendars, more reliable in some ways than watching purely local and therefore more variable signs like plant flowering, since the stars, unlike the weather, never wavered from their patient, predictable schedule.
And beyond its practical calendar function, the night sky clearly carried deep narrative and spiritual weight too, appearing repeatedly in the same rich oral tradition Polly Weissner documented, flourishing specifically in that soft, expansive nighttime register of conversation. Stories of ancestors transformed into particular stars, explanations for the origin of the Milky Way itself, cautionary tales tied to particular constellations. It's a lovely thing to consider, lying here tonight, that the same broad canopy of stars, weather and light pollution allowing, still technically hangs above you right now, the very same physical stars, many of them, that a hunter 100,000 years ago might have pointed out to a drowsy child, naming a shape, telling a story, before both of them finally closed their eyes.
Let's linger on that image of the sky for just a moment longer, because there's something quietly remarkable in the fact that this particular piece of the ancient world, unlike almost everything else we've talked about tonight, hasn't actually changed or vanished at all. Rivers shift course over centuries. Baobab trees, ancient as they are, eventually fall. Whole landscapes transform under the slow pressure of climate and time. But the stars, on any given clear night, arrange themselves overhead in almost exactly the pattern they did 100,000 years ago. There's a strange, gentle comfort in that continuity. The idea that if you could somehow step outside tonight, away from whatever light surrounds you, and look up, you'd be looking more or less at the very same quiet, patient canopy that closed every single one of those hundreds of thousands of ordinary days we've spent this evening exploring together.
And there's one last small thought I want to leave woven into this closing image before we let the whole scene finally go quiet. Every single person who ever lived through a night like the one we've spent tonight imagining, every hunter easing tired legs after a long pursuit, every mother feeling an infant's breathing slow and deepen against her chest, every elder finishing one more familiar, well-loved story before letting their own voice trail softly off, every child drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming, with the sound of adult conversation still murmuring gently nearby, was doing something you are about to do too in just a few minutes, in your own bed, in your own particular corner of a world they never could have imagined, full of lights and screens and sounds they'd find almost bewildering. And yet the actual, physical, biological act at the center of it all, the letting go, the slow surrender of a tired body into rest, hasn't changed nearly as much as everything surrounding it has. Your heart rate will slow the same way theirs did. Your breathing will deepen and even out the same way theirs did. Whatever quiet, private thoughts or images drift through your mind in these last few minutes before sleep will do so guided by roughly the very same ancient neural machinery that guided theirs, forged across all those hundreds of thousands of firelit nights we've spent this evening walking through together.
Let's slow all the way down now, all the way to a whisper, really, and spend a few minutes simply sitting inside the sensory texture of that ancient nightfall itself, because I think it's the gentlest possible place to rest before we bring everything together. Imagine the sounds first, since sound often reaches a drifting mind more easily in any other sense. The low, steady crackle and occasional soft pop of the fire settling as its wood burns down. The distant, rhythmic call of nightjars, cicadas rising and falling in long, warm waves through the dark. Somewhere further off, perhaps, the low, carrying whoop of a hyena, distant enough to be simply part of the night's wide, ordinary texture rather than any immediate threat, since everyone gathered here knows, without needing to think about it consciously, exactly how close is close, and exactly how far is safely far. The soft, unhurried murmur of voices, rising and falling, punctuated by long, comfortable silences, and the occasional ripple of quiet laughter. A child's breathing, slow and even, already asleep against someone's side. The particular, specific sound of someone gently placing one more piece of wood onto the coals, sending up a brief shower of sparks before settling back down again.
And the smells. Wood smoke, always wood smoke, worked so deeply into skin and hair and hide clothing after a lifetime lived this close to fire that it likely wouldn't even have registered anymore as a distinct scent, simply the underlying constant backdrop of what home smelled like. The dry, mineral smell of dust settling after the day's heat finally breaks, perhaps if the rains have been recent, that particular, almost unmistakably good smell of rain on dry earth, a smell so universally pleasant that scientists have actually studied it directly, given it a name, petrichor, and traced it back to specific compounds released by soil bacteria. A smell, in other words, that your own body, lying there tonight, is very likely still biologically wired to recognize and enjoy, whether or not you've ever consciously thought about why.
And the feel of it, the particular, specific warmth of a fire at a comfortable distance, not too close, not too far, calibrated by pure, long practice rather than any conscious calculation. The rough, familiar texture of a hide or woven mat beneath a tired body. The weight and warmth of another person close beside you, a parent, a child, a sibling, a friend, just rising and falling steadily, close enough to feel rather than simply hear. The particular cooling touch of night air against skin that had been sweating under direct sun only a few hours earlier. That exact drop in temperature Jerome Siegel's research identified as the real trigger, the true ancient alarm clock, telling the whole tired, satisfied body that it was finally, safely, time to let go. There's no urgency in any of this, and there never really was, not in this particular part of the day. The urgency, if there was any at all, belonged to the daylight hours, to the tracking and the digging and the careful, patient watchfulness danger sometimes required. But here, now, in this circle of dying firelight, surrounded by familiar voices and familiar smells and familiar warmth, the urgency simply dissolves, the way it's dissolving, I hope, for you too, right now,
wherever you actually are, whatever your own version of that fire and that circle of safety happens to look like tonight.
All right, let's keep moving through the morning, because there was work too, real work, and it's worth understanding what that actually looked like. In most well-studied hunter-gatherer societies, there was a fairly clear, though not absolutely rigid, division of labor by sex, and it's worth walking through both halves of it carefully, because the popular imagination, man the hunter, woman the gatherer, turns out to be both broadly true and also far more interesting in its details than that simple phrase suggests. Let's start with the women's side of camp life, because in caloric terms, in many of these societies, it was actually the more dependable half of the food supply. Among groups like the Hadza, women, often traveling in small groups, sometimes with children in tow, sometimes leaving young children with grandmothers or other caretakers back at camp, would head out to dig for tubers, wild underground roots that don't run away, don't require tracking skill, don't depend on luck the way hunting does. This is steady, reliable, if physically demanding work, using a simple digging stick, sometimes reinforced with a weighted stone, to work these deep tubers out of hard, dry ground. They'd also gather berries in season, baobab fruit, which is remarkably nutritious, and this is a detail I find genuinely lovely. They'd often locate wild honey, sometimes with the extraordinary help of a bird called the greater honey guide, a species that has, through some astonishing coevolution, learned to lead humans to beehives, chattering and flying in short hops toward the nest, waiting for the humans to break it open with smoke and tools, and then feeding on the wax and larvae left behind. It's one of the only known cases of a wild animal actively cooperating with humans to locate food for mutual benefit, and it's been going on, by some estimates, for tens of thousands of years, maybe far longer.
So, what did early humans actually do all day? We've walked through so much together tonight, waking not to an alarm but to a subtle drop in temperature, tending a fire that connects back across perhaps 1,000,000 years of continuous relationship with flame, mornings that were often unhurried and social, tubers dug by patient hands, grandmothers quietly provisioning whole family lines, hunters tracking for hours across punishing heat, meat shared according to careful, humbling custom, infants carried close through nearly every waking hour and held through every single night, plants known by the hundreds and remedies passed down like heirlooms, bone flutes and clapping hands, and healing dances stretching deep into the dark, ochre and shell beads worn simply because someone somewhere wanted to say something true about who they were, water coaxed patiently from damp sand and carried for weeks in a signed and sealed eggshell, distant friendships tended for years through careful, unequal gifts, coastlines worked at low tide, rites of passage honoring every major turn of a life, elders protected and treasured as the living memory of the whole group, great seasonal gatherings blazing bright and loud before dispersing again into quiet, and then every single evening without fail, that same soft turn from the sharp practicality of daylight into the wide, warm, story-laden hush of the fire.
None of this was simple. None of this was easy, exactly, in the way we sometimes romanticize the past as some lost paradise. There was real labor, real risk, real grief, real hunger in bad seasons. But there was also, running underneath all of it, a rhythm, a deeply, deeply practiced rhythm, refined and re-refined across an almost unimaginable span of generations, of work and rest, of tension and ease, of sharp daylight focus giving way every single evening to something rounder and softer and warmer, gathered close around a small, steady flame. And here's the thing I want to leave you with, as your own evening, your own version of that ancient firelit wind-down draws to a close right now. You are, in this very moment, doing something that connects you, in an unbroken chain stretching back further than history, further than agriculture, further even than language as we'd recognize it, to every single one of your ancestors who ever settled down at the end of a long day. Let the sharp edges of daytime concern soften into something quieter, and allowed themselves, finally, to rest.
You don't need to remember any of the names we talked about tonight. Wiesner, Hawks, Liebenberg, Wrangham, Bohm. You don't need to hold on to the details of persistence hunting or tuber digging or the precise arguments around fire control at Wonderwork Cave a million years ago. Let all of that go now, gently, the way the last faintest glow of a fire lets go of its final embers.
What I do want you to hold on to, if anything at all, is just this feeling, this quiet, grounding, almost startlingly old feeling that you are exactly where you're supposed to be right now, at the close of a day, safe, warm, surrounded by whatever small, ordinary comforts you have around you, doing the single oldest, most universal thing a human being can do at the end of the light, resting, letting the sharp edges soften, letting the stories drift. There's nothing left to figure out tonight, nothing left to solve, nothing left to hold on to at all. The fire is low. The circle is quiet. Everyone you ever were, going back through all that impossibly deep time, is settling down now too, right alongside you. Sleep well.